My stepmother tried to sell my mother's jewelry, so I bought it all back and gave her costume jewelry instead. The funeral was over 3 months ago, but I still couldn't bring myself to go through all of Mom's things without feeling like someone was squeezing my chest with a vice. Dad had remarried about 2 years after Mom passed, and honestly I thought I was okay with it until this whole mess started. His new wife seemed nice enough at first, always bringing casseroles to family dinners and asking about my college classes with what felt like genuine interest. But something changed after Dad had his minor heart attack last spring, and suddenly she was acting like she owned the place where I grew up. I was staying at the house for a long weekend, helping Dad organize some paperwork for his medical bills, when I noticed the jewelry box missing from Mom's dresser. This wasn't just any jewelry box either. It was this gorgeous hand-carved wooden thing with intricate roses that Dad had bought for Mom on their 10th anniversary. Inside was everything that mattered. Her engagement ring, the pearl necklace from her grandmother, those little diamond earrings she wore to my high school graduation, and about a dozen other pieces that held memories I couldn't even begin to explain to someone who hadn't lived them. My stomach dropped when I realized it was gone, and I practically ran downstairs to find Dad reading the newspaper in his usual chair. When I asked him about it, he looked confused for a moment before his face got that uncomfortable expression he always wore when he had to deal with anything remotely confrontational. He told me his wife had mentioned something about getting the jewelry appraised for insurance purposes, which seemed reasonable enough until I pressed him for more details, and he started fidgeting with his coffee cup the way he always did when he was hiding something. The next morning, I decided to drive around to a few local jewelry stores and pawn shops, just to see if maybe she really was getting things appraised like she claimed. The third place I stopped at was this little family-owned shop downtown, where an elderly man behind the counter immediately recognized me when I described some of the pieces. He told me a woman had come in 2 days earlier trying to sell exactly what I was looking for, and when I showed him a photo of my stepmother from my phone, he nodded and said that was definitely her. My hands were actually shaking as I asked him if he still had any of the pieces, and thankfully, he explained that they had a 3-day holding period for all jewelry purchases in case the original owners wanted to buy things back. Everything was still there, sitting in a small tray behind the counter, looking exactly the same as the last time I'd seen Mom wear them. The shop owner seemed to understand the situation without me having to explain too much, and he let me buy everything back for exactly what he'd paid my stepmother, which was honestly way less than what any of it was actually worth. Driving home with that familiar jewelry box sitting in my passenger seat felt like getting a piece of my mom back, but I was also angrier than I'd been in years. The betrayal wasn't just about the money or even the jewelry itself. It was about the complete disrespect for my mother's memory and the way my stepmother had lied so easily to both me and Dad about her intentions. I knew I couldn't just confront her directly because Dad's health was still fragile, and the last thing I wanted was to cause him more stress during his recovery. Instead, I came up with what I thought was a pretty brilliant plan that would teach her a lesson without creating a huge family drama. I spent the next week shopping at various department stores and online retailers, finding the most convincing costume jewelry I could find that looked similar to Mom's real pieces. There were fake pearl necklaces that looked almost identical to the real ones, cubic zirconia earrings that sparkled just like diamonds under the right light, and even a replica engagement ring that would fool most people unless they looked really closely. The hardest part was actually switching everything out without getting caught, but I managed to do it one afternoon when my stepmother was at her book club and Dad was napping upstairs. I carefully placed all the fake pieces in Mom's jewelry box exactly where the real ones had been, then hid the authentic jewelry in a safety deposit box at my bank downtown. Everything looked perfect, and I was pretty proud of myself for coming up with such a clever solution that would hopefully prevent any future theft attempts. About 2 weeks later, I got a phone call from Dad that made my blood run cold. He was speaking in this really quiet, shaky voice, and told me that my stepmother had been arrested for trying to sell stolen jewelry at a different pawn shop across town. Apparently, she'd gotten greedy and decided to try selling what she thought were the same pieces again, not realizing they were now worthless fakes. The pawn shop owner had become suspicious when the jewelry turned out to be costume pieces, but she was insisting they were valuable family heirlooms. What I hadn't anticipated was that my stepmother would actually call the police herself when the pawn shop owner accused her of fraud, claiming that someone must have switched out her jewelry with fakes. She was absolutely convinced that she was the victim of some elaborate theft, and she spent hours at the police station trying to explain how someone had apparently broken into the house and replaced valuable jewelry with costume pieces without taking anything else. The whole situation got even more complicated when the police decided to investigate her claims, and they ended up interviewing both me and Dad about the missing jewelry. I had to make a really difficult decision about whether to tell the truth about what I'd done or let my stepmother continue, believing she was the victim of some mysterious jewelry thief. Dad looked so tired and confused during the whole ordeal, and I could see that the stress was really affecting his recovery from the heart attack. I finally decided to come clean to the police about switching the jewelry, but I also showed them the receipt from the pawn shop where I'd bought everything back, proving that my stepmother had tried to sell Mom's jewelry without permission. The officer who took my statement seemed to understand why I'd done what I did, especially when I explained that I was trying to protect my father's health while also preserving my mother's memory. The charges against my stepmother were eventually dropped since the jewelry technically belonged to Dad and he hadn't explicitly forbidden her from selling it, but the whole incident created a huge rift in their marriage. Dad was devastated when he realized what had happened, not just because of the attempted theft, but because of all the lies and deception that had been going on right under his nose. He told me later that he'd started noticing other small things disappearing from the house over the past few months, but he'd assumed he was just misplacing things due to his medications. My stepmother tried to apologize and explain that she'd only been trying to help with the medical bills, but the trust was completely broken by that point. She moved out of the house about a month later, and Dad filed for divorce shortly after that. I felt terrible about being the catalyst for their marriage falling apart, especially since Dad had seemed genuinely happy with her before all this happened. But then something unexpected happened that completely changed my perspective on the whole situation. While helping Dad clean out the spare bedroom where my stepmother had been storing some of her belongings, we found a whole collection of items that had clearly been taken from around the house over the past several months. There were family photos in expensive frames, some of Dad's vintage watches, a few pieces of Mom's china, and even some of my old baseball trophies from high school that I'd assumed were just packed away somewhere. It became obvious that the jewelry incident wasn't just about helping with medical bills. My stepmother had been systematically taking valuable items from the house and selling them, probably for months before I caught her with Mom's jewelry. Dad was shocked and hurt all over again, but I think he was also relieved to know that his memory wasn't failing and that he hadn't been imagining things disappearing. We ended up finding receipts and documentation that showed she'd sold thousands of dollars worth of family belongings over the past year, including some things that had belonged to Dad's parents and grandparents. The betrayal went so much deeper than I'd originally realized, and I was grateful that my decision to buy back Mom's jewelry had exposed what was really going on before even more irreplaceable family heirlooms were lost forever. The divorce proceedings were pretty ugly, especially when Dad's lawyer presented evidence of all the items that had been sold without permission. My stepmother tried to claim that she'd had Dad's verbal permission to sell things, but there was no way to prove that, and some of the items she'd sold were clearly personal belongings that no reasonable person would assume they could just take. During this whole process, I also discovered that my stepmother had been lying about a lot of other things too. She'd told us she was widowed when she met Dad, but it turned out she was actually divorced and was still receiving alimony payments from her ex-husband. She'd also claimed to be struggling financially, which was part of why Dad had felt sorry for her and wanted to help. But the bank records showed she had significant savings and investments that she'd never mentioned. The more we learned about who she really was, the more I realized how lucky we were that I'd caught her when I did. There's no telling how much more she might have stolen, or what other lies she might have told if the jewelry incident hadn't exposed her true character. Dad was heartbroken about the whole situation, but he also seemed relieved to know the truth about the woman he'd married. What really got to me was thinking about how my mom would have handled all of this. She always had this incredible ability to see through people's facades and trust her instincts about character, something I'd apparently inherited but hadn't fully developed until this situation forced me to pay attention. I kept thinking about how she would have been devastated to know that her jewelry had been sold, but also how proud she would have been that I'd fought to get it back and protect Dad from further harm. The whole experience taught me that sometimes you have to be willing to make difficult decisions to protect the people you love, even when it means getting involved in messy situations that you'd rather avoid. I'd always been the type of person who tried to stay out of family drama and let adults handle their own problems. But watching my stepmother take advantage of Dad's kindness and trust made me realize that sometimes staying silent isn't the right choice. Dad's health actually improved significantly after my stepmother moved out, which made me wonder how much stress her presence had been causing him without any of us realizing it. He seemed more relaxed and more like his old self, and he started talking about Mom again in a way he hadn't since he'd remarried. It was like getting a piece of my father back along with getting Mom's jewelry back. We ended up having a really honest conversation about the whole situation, and Dad admitted that he'd rushed into remarrying because he was lonely and scared of being alone after Mom died. He said he'd ignored some red flags about my stepmother's character because he desperately wanted to believe that he could be happy again, but the whole experience had taught him that healing from loss takes time and can't be rushed. I decided to keep Mom's jewelry in the safety deposit box for now, but Dad and I made plans to go through it together and decide which pieces should be saved for future generations, and which ones might be appropriate for me to give to someone special someday. It felt good to be able to make those decisions together, instead of having them made for us by someone who had no right to touch Mom's belongings in the first place. The strangest part of the whole ordeal was how it actually brought Dad and me closer together than we'd been since Mom died. We'd both been so focused on trying to move forward and create a new normal that we hadn't really dealt with our grief properly, and my stepmother's presence had somehow made that even more difficult. Having to work together to handle this crisis reminded us that we were still a family, even if it was just the two of us now. Looking back, I'm grateful that I trusted my instincts when I noticed the jewelry box was missing, and I'm proud that I came up with a plan that protected both my mother's memory and my father's well-being. The whole situation could have been handled differently, but I think I made the best decisions I could with the information I had at the time. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't decided to drive around to those pawn shops that day, or if the shop owner hadn't still had Mom's jewelry when I found him. The thought of those precious pieces being lost forever, scattered to strangers who had no idea of their sentimental value, still makes my chest feel tight. But they're safe now, locked away where they belong, waiting for the right time to be worn and loved again. The whole experience also made me realize how much I'd taken for granted about my relationship with my parents, and how important it is to protect the people and things that matter most to you, even when it means stepping outside your comfort zone. I learned that sometimes being a good son means being willing to fight for what's right, even when it's messy and uncomfortable and might hurt people's feelings. My stepmother never tried to contact us after the divorce was finalized, which was probably for the best given everything that had happened. I heard through mutual friends that she'd moved to a different state, and was apparently telling people that she'd been the victim of a vindictive stepson who'd orchestrated an elaborate scheme to break up her marriage. Part of me felt bad that she couldn't take responsibility for her own actions, but mostly I was just relieved that she was no longer part of our lives. Dad started dating again about a year later, but this time he was much more careful and took things very slowly. He'd learned to trust his instincts better and to pay attention to red flags that he might have ignored before. When he did eventually introduce me to someone new, it was clear that he'd chosen someone who respected his past and understood that my mom would always be an important part of his life story. The new relationship felt completely different from the beginning, more honest, more respectful, and built on a foundation of genuine compatibility rather than loneliness and desperation. Dad seemed happier and more confident, and I could tell that the painful experience with my stepmother had actually taught him valuable lessons about what he really wanted in a partner. As for Mom's jewelry, I eventually decided to have a few pieces reset and updated so that they could be worn and enjoyed rather than just stored away. I kept her engagement ring and wedding band exactly as they were, but I had some of the other pieces redesigned into more contemporary styles that would be appropriate for special occasions. It felt like a way to honor her memory while also allowing her jewelry to continue being part of our family's story. The whole ordeal taught me that protecting the people and things you love sometimes requires difficult decisions and uncomfortable confrontations. But it also showed me that doing the right thing, even when it's complicated and messy, usually leads to better outcomes than ignoring problems and hoping they'll resolve themselves. My mom's jewelry is safe, Dad is happier and healthier, and our family is stronger because we faced this challenge together instead of letting it tear us apart.